What happens when a state stops executing but keeps adding names to death row? Ohio hasn't carried out an execution in nearly 7 years, yet the number of inmates sentenced to die keeps growing. Some have been waiting for decades. Others have upcoming dates, though even those are shrouded in uncertainty. Today, we take you inside the walls of Ohio's death row, exploring who's next in line, why executions keep getting postponed, and what the future of capital punishment holds in this state. From convicted killers with scheduled dates to inmates whose time was pushed forward by years. Today, we reveal every criminal currently awaiting execution in Ohio and what might come next. Stay tuned. Kareem M. Jackson, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime 24. In March 25, 1997, Kareem M. Jackson, along with an accomplice, carefully planned and executed a brutal double homicide that would forever alter the lives of 2 families. The victims, Antoine Hunter and Terrence Walker, were lured into a trap under the pretense of a drug deal. Jackson and his accomplice had no intention of making a simple exchange, as they were determined to rob the victims, believing they had money or drugs on them. The encounter took place in a secluded apartment in Columbus, Ohio, where the 2 victims, unaware of the deadly turn the night would take, entered the premises. Once inside the apartment, the situation quickly turned violent. Jackson and his accomplice immediately restrained the 2 victims, binding their hands and feet with duct tape, rendering them helpless and unable to resist. It was clear from the outset that Jackson and his accomplice had no plans to let the victims walk away. They moved swiftly to ensure that there would be no witnesses, as both men were forced to the ground and made to lie face down, their fates sealed. The brutality of the situation unfolded as Jackson and his accomplice, both armed with firearms, prepared to execute the victims. Jackson's accomplice executed the first victim, Terrence Walker, shooting him in the head at point-blank range. Not satisfied with the immediate death of Walker, the second victim, Antoine Petty, was similarly executed in cold blood. The precision of the killings indicated a chilling level of preparation and intent, and the 2 victims had no chance of survival. After the murders, Jackson and his accomplice left the apartment, leaving behind 2 lifeless bodies. The apartment remained undisturbed for hours, and it wasn't until a concerned family member, worried about the victims not returning home, discovered the crime scene. This crime led to Jackson's arrest on March 28, 1997, and subsequent conviction for multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and robbery. The court found that Jackson's actions, which involved a cold-blooded execution of 2 victims, were beyond the bounds of typical criminal behavior. He was sentenced to death, and his case has remained in the courts for decades. Despite multiple appeals, Jackson's conviction and sentence have been upheld. He remains on Ohio's death row, where his scheduled execution has been set for December 10, 2025. However, due to ongoing legal and logistical issues with Ohio's execution protocols, Jackson's fate remains uncertain, and his case continues to be a focal point in debates surrounding the future of capital punishment in the state. Gerald Hand, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime 52. Gerald Robert Hand's case stands out as one of Ohio's most chilling examples of long-term calculated murder for profit. Born in 1949, Hand appeared to lead a fairly ordinary life in suburban Columbus until the pieces began to fall into place following the murder of his 4th wife, Jill Hand, on January 15, 2002. On that night, Hand frantically called 911, claiming that a man had broken into their home and shot his wife. He said he returned fire and killed the intruder. The man he shot was Walter Lonnie Welch, a longtime friend and former employee. Initially, the story seemed plausible, a home invasion gone wrong. But investigators found several red flags, including inconsistencies in Hand's account, the unusual calmness of the crime scene, and questions about his relationship with Welch. As detectives dug deeper, it became clear that this wasn't a random act of violence, it was a setup. prosecutors discovered that Gerald Hand had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Jill before her murder. Moreover, the forensic evidence didn't align with his version of events. Phone records and witness testimony further indicated that Hand had lured Welch into a murder-for-hire scheme to end Jill's life, with the promise of a cut from the insurance payout. But once the job was done, Hand executed Welch too, likely to tie off loose ends and stage the whole thing as a botched burglary. His cold calculation and ability to eliminate those closest to him shocked investigators and later the courtroom. The trial took a dark turn when authorities re-examined the deaths of two of Hand's previous wives, both of whom had died under similarly suspicious circumstances decades earlier. His first wife, Donna, was found strangled in their basement in 1976, and just 3 years later, his second wife, Lori, also died from strangulation, again in the same house. At the time, both deaths were ruled as unrelated tragedies, and no charges were filed. But in hindsight, with the pattern of Jill's murder and Hand's connection to life insurance policies in each case, prosecutors made the bold claim that these were not coincidences and they were calculated killings. The theory was that Hand had been orchestrating murders for years, manipulating friends and spouses alike for financial gain. In 2003, Gerald Hand stood trial for the murders of both Jill Hand and Walter Welch. The jury heard overwhelming evidence of premeditation, financial motive, and a pattern of deadly behavior stretching back over 25 years. He was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder, among other charges, and was sentenced to death on June 4, 2003. His defense team fought the conviction for years, arguing errors in the trial and challenging the use of past spousal deaths as circumstantial evidence. Today, Gerald Hand sits on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio, awaiting his scheduled execution date of June 17, 2026. Though he was initially set to be executed in 2023, ongoing complications with Ohio's lethal injection protocol and drug availability led to multiple delays. His case continues to draw attention, not just because of the number of lives lost, but because of the staggering patience and manipulation involved in his crimes. Kwesi Bryan, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 29. Kwesi Bryan was 29 years old when he committed the crime that would earn him a place on Ohio's death row. On the morning of June 25, 2000, Cleveland police officer Wayne Leon pulled Bryan over at a gas station near East 40th Street and Community College Avenue. Bryan, who was driving with a suspended license and knew he was a wanted parole violator, pulled a hidden firearm and shot Officer Leon in the face at point-blank range. The 26-year-old officer, a husband and father of 3, died almost instantly. The killing occurred in broad daylight in front of multiple witnesses and shocked the city. Bryan fled the scene but was captured a few hours later after an intense manhunt. His violent past and motive to avoid going back to prison made it clear that this was no accident. It was a calculated execution of a police officer. Bryan was already on parole at the time of Officer Leon's murder, having served time for a 1995 attempted robbery conviction. During his trial in 2001, the prosecution argued that Bryan deliberately shot the officer to avoid being arrested for his parole violation and outstanding warrants. Surveillance footage, eyewitnesses, and forensic evidence left little room for doubt. The jury found Bryan guilty of aggravated murder with a death penalty specification. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors emphasized not only the brutality of the crime, but also Bryan's lengthy criminal history. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection, and the trial court also imposed a separate prison sentence for related offenses, including weapon possession and fleeing the scene. Years after the murder conviction, disturbing new charges surfaced. In 2007, while already serving time on death row, Bryan was linked to multiple assaults in Cleveland, dating back to the late 1990s. He eventually pled guilty to those charges and received an additional sentence of 48 years. Then in 2014, he was tried and convicted again for the 1994 kidnapping and assault of a woman. This conviction came after DNA evidence tied him to the crime, and the victim positively identified him. The court handed down an additional sentence of 20 to 50 years for that case. Brian's history of violent and predatory behavior expanded his profile as not just a cop killer, but a repeat offender with a pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals. Although his execution was originally scheduled for October 26, 2022, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine issued a stay due to ongoing issues with the state's lethal injection protocol and concerns about sourcing the necessary drugs. The execution was rescheduled to January 7, 2026, aligning with a broader pattern of delayed executions across the state as Ohio debates the future of capital punishment. As of now, Kwesi Bryan remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he awaits his rescheduled execution date. Danny Lee Hill, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime 18. Danny Lee Hill was only 18 years old when he committed one of the most brutal and unforgettable crimes in Ohio's history. On September 10, 1985, in Warren, Ohio, Hill and 17-year-old Timothy Combs lured 12-year-old Raymond Fife, a Boy Scout and paperboy, off his bicycle as he rode to a friend's house. What followed was an act of cruelty that shocked the conscience of the entire state. The two teens dragged Raymond into a wooded area, where they beat, tortured, and assaulted him in the most horrific ways imaginable. His body was discovered hours later, naked, burned, and barely alive. He was rushed to the hospital, where he succumbed to his injuries 2 days later. The sheer sadism of the attack, burn marks, bite marks, and other gruesome injuries sparked immediate public outrage and led to a swift investigation. Law enforcement quickly narrowed in on Hill and Combs. Within days, both were arrested and confessed to their involvement. Hill even led police to the crime scene and described the attack in detail. During his trial, forensic evidence further confirmed his role, most notably the bite marks on Raymond's body, which matched Hill's dental impressions. He was charged with multiple counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, and felonious assault. Since Hill was legally considered an adult under Ohio law, prosecutors pursued the death penalty. Combs, being underage, was not eligible for capital punishment and instead received a life sentence. On March 5, 1986, a 3-judge panel sentenced Danny Lee Hill to death. The community of Warren, still reeling from the heinous nature of the crime, viewed the sentence as a long-awaited moment of justice. In the meantime, Hill has remained on Ohio's death row for nearly 4 decades. His execution has been postponed multiple times due to legal challenges and issues with Ohio's lethal injection protocol. In 2022, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine issued a new execution date for Hill, July 22, 2026, as part of a broader reshuffling of the state's execution schedule. This comes amid growing criticism of Ohio's capital punishment system and mounting concerns over the ability to obtain execution drugs. Hill's case stands out not only for its extreme violence, but also for how long he has managed to avoid execution, despite being convicted and sentenced in the mid-1980s. His name remains one of the most recognized among Ohio's condemned inmates. Today, Danny Lee Hill remains on death row at Chillicothe Correctional Institution, awaiting his execution in 2026. His continued incarceration has brought little closure to the Fife family, who have endured a nearly 40-year-long legal roller coaster. James E. Trimble, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime 44. James E. Trimble, a 44-year-old man from Brimfield Township, Ohio, committed one of the most chilling crime sprees in the state's recent history. On January 21, 2005, Trimble was at the home of his girlfriend, Renee Bauer, when a domestic dispute spiraled into an unthinkable tragedy. Armed with a high-powered rifle, Trimble shot and ended the life of Renee during the argument. But the horror didn't stop there. Renee's 7-year-old son, Dakota Bauer, was also in the home at the time. In what prosecutors later described as a deliberate and calculated act, Trimble turned the weapon on the child and took his life as well. The brutal slaying of a mother and her young son shocked the small community of Brimfield and ignited a statewide manhunt. Trimble fled the scene, fully armed, and prepared to commit even more violence before the night was over. After leaving the Bauer residence, Trimble forced entry into a nearby home, where Sarah Positano, a 22-year-old Kent State University student, lived. He held her hostage for hours in a tense standoff with law enforcement. Positano was a complete stranger to Trimble. His intrusion into her life was purely out of desperation and chaos. Negotiators attempted to de-escalate the situation and convince Trimble to surrender, but by the next morning, the situation took a grim turn. Trimble shot and ended Sarah's life before giving himself up to the police. The calculated nature of this second hostage murder, occurring only hours after the first two killings, further revealed the depth of his violence and disregard for life. In total, 3 innocent lives were lost in less than 24 hours. Following his arrest, Trimble faced multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, aggravated burglary, and other felonies. The prosecution moved quickly, seeking the death penalty for the triple homicide. During his 2005 trial, jurors heard deeply disturbing evidence, including ballistic reports, forensic testimony, and Trimble's own statements. The state emphasized the particularly brutal nature of the crimes. A domestic dispute that escalated to the murder of a child, followed by the random hostage killing of a college student. On October 25, 2005, the jury found James Trimble guilty on all counts. 3 weeks later, on November 22, 2005, he was formally sentenced to death for each of the 3 murders, plus additional consecutive prison terms for the remaining charges. The victims' families described the sentencing as a small but necessary measure of justice. Currently, James E. Trimble is scheduled to be executed on March 12, 2026, nearly 21 years after his crimes. His name is one of several on Ohio's execution schedule, which has seen constant delays due to ongoing legal and pharmaceutical challenges. For the families of Renee Bauer, Dakota Bauer, and Sarah Positano, the wait for closure has been excruciating. Their lives were changed forever in a single night of terror, and the memory of their loved ones remains central to their advocacy for justice. Jerome Henderson, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 26. Jerome Henderson, born January 29, 1959, was convicted for the brutal 1985 murder of his neighbor, 26-year-old Mary Akoff, in Cincinnati, Ohio. On March 3, 1985, Henderson broke into Akoff's apartment with the intent to assault her. Akoff was home with her young daughter at the time. According to court documents, Henderson attempted to force himself on her, leading to a violent struggle. He eventually overpowered her, stabbing her multiple times in the chest and abdomen, then slashing her throat so deeply that her head was nearly severed. The horror of the crime was discovered when Akoff's 10-year-old daughter returned home and found her mother's body lying in a pool of blood. Henderson's arrest came shortly after the murder, when authorities connected him to the crime through witness testimonies and forensic evidence, including fingerprints found at the scene. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated murder, attempted SA, and aggravated burglary. During trial proceedings, the jury was presented with the gruesome details of the attack and the trauma inflicted on the victim's young daughter. The prosecution argued that Henderson's actions were premeditated and vicious, deserving the maximum penalty under Ohio law. The defense offered little in the way of mitigation, and Henderson showed minimal remorse throughout the proceedings. He was found guilty on all counts. On August 5, 1985, the jury recommended and the court imposed the death penalty for the aggravated murder conviction. His death sentence was affirmed by the Ohio Supreme Court on September 28, 1988, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review the case on March 6, 1989. Originally scheduled to be executed on September 14, 2023, Henderson's execution was postponed due to Ohio's ongoing issues with sourcing lethal injection drugs. His new execution date has been set for October 21, 2026, giving him a temporary reprieve while the state reconsiders its execution protocols. Henderson currently remains on death row at the Ross Correctional Institution, where he has been incarcerated for nearly 4 decades. James D. O'Neill, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 39. James Derrick O'Neill, born on July 10, 1954, was convicted for the cold-blooded murder of his estranged wife, Carol Ann O'Neill, in Cincinnati, Ohio. The crime occurred on December 11, 1993, during a period of escalating tension between the couple. According to court documents, Carol had previously evicted James from the home they once shared, which deeply angered him. On the day of the murder, O'Neill unlawfully entered her home, chased her upstairs, and shot her multiple times. Carol, who had tried to escape, collapsed and died at the scene. What made the murder even more chilling was the fact that James later told authorities that he wanted to teach her a lesson. This statement underscored the level of personal rage and intent involved in the killing. O'Neill was arrested shortly after the incident and charged with aggravated murder and related offenses. During the trial, the prosecution presented damning evidence, including his confession and the testimonies of witnesses who heard the gunshots and observed his erratic behavior leading up to the crime. The courtroom also heard how the couple's relationship had deteriorated, with Carol previously expressing fear for her safety. James O'Neill's defense did not dispute that he was the shooter, but attempted to argue diminished capacity. However, the jury found the evidence of premeditation and intent to be overwhelming. His lack of remorse and the brutality of the crime left a lasting impact on both the courtroom and Carol's grieving family. On December 15, 1995, after being found guilty, James D. O'Neill was formally sentenced to death by the Hamilton County Court of Common Pleas. Since then, he has remained on Ohio's death row. O'Neill's appeals over the years have been largely unsuccessful. He challenged aspects of his trial proceedings, his representation, and later, Ohio's lethal injection protocol. His legal team argued that the state had not followed the proper administrative procedures when adopting its method of execution. However, in 2021, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld the state's protocol, ruling that no violations of state law had occurred in its implementation. Initially scheduled to be executed on August 16, 2023, O'Neill received a temporary reprieve due to the state's inability to obtain lethal injection drugs and ongoing reevaluation of its death penalty procedures. His execution date has since been rescheduled to August 19, 2026. As of now, James D. O'Neill continues to await execution at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Melvin D. Bunnell Jr. Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 30. Melvin D. Bunnell Jr. was born in 1957 and resided in Cleveland, Ohio at the time of the crime. At 30 years old, Bonnell committed the murder of 23-year-old Robert Eugene Bunner on November 28, 1987, in what would become one of the more controversial death penalty cases in Ohio's history. The events unfolded in the early hours of the morning when Bonnell knocked on the apartment door of Bunner and 2 roommates, pretending to be someone named Charles. Once inside, he drew a firearm and opened fire on Bunner, striking him multiple times. Witness Shirley Hatch, present at the scene, immediately fled the apartment and contacted law enforcement. Another roommate, Edward Birmingham, managed to confront and force Bonnell out of the apartment after the shooting, which ultimately saved his own life. Soon after fleeing the scene, Bonnell became involved in a car crash while being pursued by police. A firearm was recovered near the crash site, which was later matched to the bullets recovered from Bunner's body, effectively linking Bonnell to the murder weapon. Additionally, eyewitnesses, including those in the apartment, identified Bonnell as the shooter. He was arrested shortly afterward and charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder, including felony murder and firearm specifications, and 1 count of aggravated burglary. The trial commenced in early 1988 and lasted 5 days. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury returned a guilty verdict, and Bonnell was sentenced to death in March 1988. The Ohio Supreme Court later described the evidence against him as overwhelming during the review of his direct appeal. Over the next several decades, Bonnell pursued multiple appeals and post-conviction motions. A central theme in his defense has been that crucial evidence, including exculpatory witness statements, ballistics reports, and other physical materials, was allegedly withheld or destroyed by the prosecution. For years, officials claimed that key evidence no longer existed, preventing further DNA or forensic testing. However, in a surprising turn of events in 2020, Bonnell's legal team discovered that several pieces of physical evidence were, in fact, still intact. This included blood swabs, a bullet, and shell casings. The revelation prompted his lawyers to file new motions, arguing that the prosecution's misconduct undermined the fairness of the original trial. They also sought the disqualification of the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, citing conflicts of interest and decades of alleged bad faith behavior. Despite these developments, Bonnell's efforts to secure a new trial have so far been unsuccessful. His execution has been delayed numerous times due to Ohio's ongoing issues with lethal injection protocols and drug availability. Originally set for October 18, 2023, his execution has now been rescheduled for November 18, 2026, following a reprieve issued by Governor Mike DeWine. Bonnell remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he continues to await further court decisions regarding his appeals. His case remains one of the most contested in Ohio's modern death penalty history, particularly due to the questions surrounding withheld evidence and the fairness of his original trial. Antonio S. Franklin, Correctional Center, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 24. Antonio S. Franklin, born in 1973, was 24 years old when he committed a heinous crime that would forever alter the course of his life. On the night of April 18, 1997, Franklin brutally murdered his grandparents, Ivory and Ophelia Franklin, and his uncle, Anthony Franklin, in a crime that shocked the city of Dayton, Ohio. The murders took place in the family's home when Franklin, in a fit of rage, bludgeoned his relatives with a baseball bat before setting their house on fire. After the killings, Franklin stole his grandfather's car and fled to Tennessee, where he was apprehended the following day. At the time of his arrest, Franklin was found in possession of his grandmother's jewelry, linking him to the crime. The brutal nature of the murders and Franklin's actions in the aftermath stunned both the local community and law enforcement officials. Franklin's arrest led to him being charged with multiple serious offenses, including aggravated murder, aggravated arson, and aggravated robbery. During his trial, Franklin pled not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming that he was suffering from mental illness at the time of the crime. He also raised concerns about his competence to stand trial. However, after psychiatric evaluations and legal proceedings, the court determined that Franklin was fit to face trial and rejected his insanity defense. His trial began in 1998, and after several days of testimony, the jury convicted Franklin of the 3 aggravated murders and other related charges. The evidence against him, including the baseball bat, stolen property, and eyewitness accounts, was overwhelming. In August 1998, after Franklin's conviction, the jury returned a death sentence recommendation due to the brutal nature of the crime. The Hamilton County Court of Common Pleas formally sentenced him to death. Over the years, Franklin's case remained under review, with his execution date repeatedly delayed. In 2018, the Ohio Supreme Court set January 12, 2023, as the date for his execution by lethal injection. However, due to ongoing concerns about Ohio's execution protocol and the availability of lethal injection drugs, Governor Mike DeWine issued a reprieve on July 1, 2022. The reprieve pushed Franklin's execution date to February 11, 2026. Franklin currently resides on Ohio's death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Scott A. Group. Correctional Facility, Chillicothe, Ohio. Age at crime, 31. Scott A. Group, a former delivery driver from Struthers, Ohio, committed a brutal crime that shocked the local community. On January 18, 1997, Group entered the downtown bar in Youngstown, a place he had frequented professionally while working for Ohio Wine Imports. That morning, he approached the owners, Robert and Sandra Lozier, under the pretense of addressing a business-related matter. However, his real motive was far darker. Group forced the couple into a back restroom, pulled out a .38 caliber revolver, and shot both of them, ending the life of 56-year-old Robert Lozier and seriously injuring his wife Sandra, who survived after being shot in the head. He then robbed the bar and fled the scene, igniting a manhunt that would ultimately lead to his arrest and conviction. The crime bore signs of premeditation. Witnesses testified that Group had been acting erratically prior to the murder, and discrepancies had already been discovered in his cash deliveries. Just a day before the murders, Group abruptly quit his job. It was also reported that co-workers had seen him carrying a firearm, a detail that raised concern but had not been acted upon until after the tragedy occurred. During the trial, prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of Group's motive, suggesting that his intent was both robbery and retaliation against the Loziers, possibly due to financial disputes or perceived slights. Sandra Lozier, despite her injuries, was able to testify and identify Group as her attacker, further solidifying the state's case against him. Group was found guilty of aggravated murder, attempted murder, aggravated robbery, and intimidation in a trial that garnered significant media attention in northeastern Ohio. In 1998, he was sentenced to death, a verdict later upheld by the Ohio Supreme Court in 2002, which referred to the evidence as strong and convincing. In 2019, the Ohio Supreme Court scheduled Group's execution for January 10, 2024. However, due to the ongoing moratorium on executions in Ohio and complications related to the sourcing of lethal injection drugs, Governor Mike DeWine issued a reprieve on July 1, 2022. Group's new execution date has been postponed to February 17, 2027. He currently remains on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Archie J. Dixon. Correctional Facility, Ross. Age at crime, 20. Archie J. Dixon, a death row inmate in Ohio, was convicted for one of the most chilling murders the state had seen in the 1990s. On September 22, 1993, in Toledo, Ohio, Dixon and his accomplice, Timothy Hoffner, plotted and carried out the brutal killing of Dixon's roommate, Christopher Hammer, in order to steal his identity and sell his vehicle. The duo lured Hammer to a house under false pretenses, claiming it was a casual meeting. Once inside, the encounter turned violent. Hoffner attempted to snap Hammer's neck, while Dixon smashed a wine bottle over his head. The two then tied Hammer to a bunk bed ladder, stripped him of his identification documents, and planned to take over his identity for financial gain. The crime took a sinister turn when they transported Hammer to a secluded, pre-dug grave, where they gagged, blindfolded, and buried him alive. At the time of the crime, Archie Dixon was just 20 years old. After the murder, Dixon tried to cover his tracks by using Hammer's name to sell his car and assume his identity. The disappearance of Christopher Hammer soon triggered a missing persons investigation. Authorities became suspicious when the buyer of Hammer's car provided documentation traced back to Dixon. Meanwhile, Timothy Hoffner, under pressure during police questioning, eventually led authorities to the gravesite. The evidence recovered, including the body and personal documents, connected Dixon and Hoffner directly to the crime. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Dixon initially denied involvement, but later confessed to the murder once confronted with Hoffner's testimony and physical evidence. Dixon's trial began on October 30, 1995, and concluded on November 6, 1995. The jury returned guilty verdicts on November 7, 1995, and recommended the death sentence on November 9, 1995. The court formally sentenced Dixon to death on November 22, 1995, as he was found guilty of aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, kidnapping, and forgery. He was sentenced to death by the Lucas County Court of Common Pleas. The Ohio Supreme Court later upheld the conviction, emphasizing the overwhelming nature of the evidence and rejecting Dixon's appeal regarding the admissibility of his confession. Dixon has been incarcerated on death row at the Ross Correctional Institution in Ohio for nearly 3 decades. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times due to issues with Ohio's lethal injection protocol. Most recently, his execution date was pushed to June 16, 2027, by order of Governor Mike DeWine, as part of a broader moratorium on executions in the state. The chilling nature of Dixon's crime, burying a man alive for identity theft, continues to resonate as one of the most disturbing capital cases in Ohio's recent history. Despite the passage of time, the families of the victims still await justice, and Dixon remains among those who have exhausted most of their legal avenues. John D. Stumpf, Correctional Facility, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 23. John David Stumpf, born on September 16, 1960, was 23 years old when he committed a violent home invasion that shocked the small town of New Concord, Ohio. On May 14, 1984, Stumpf and an accomplice, Clyde Daniel Wesley, devised a plan to rob the home of Mary Jane and Norman Stout by posing as stranded motorists. The unsuspecting couple allowed them inside, offering help. Once inside, the two men brandished firearms and demanded valuables. The situation quickly escalated into a brutal crime in which Norman Stout was shot twice in the head and miraculously survived, albeit with permanent damage, while Mary Jane Stout was shot multiple times, ultimately dying from 4 gunshot wounds. Stumpf and Wesley then stole the couple's vehicle and several items before fleeing the scene. The crime deeply unsettled the community and launched an intense investigation that quickly led to Stumpf's arrest. Stumpf confessed to his involvement during a post-arrest interrogation and eventually agreed to plead guilty before a 3-judge panel. He was charged with aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, and multiple counts of grand theft. During the proceedings, he claimed that Wesley was the one who actually shot and ended Mary Jane's life, while he only shot Norman. Nevertheless, prosecutors painted Stumpf as the primary aggressor and pressed for the death penalty. On September 24, 1984, the court sentenced him to death, stating that the aggravating circumstances clearly outweighed any mitigating factors. Notably, he waived his right to a jury trial, which significantly limited his opportunities to present mitigating evidence, including his impoverished background, limited education, and signs of cognitive impairment. During Wesley's separate trial, the same prosecution team argued that he, not Stumpf, had fired the fatal shots that ended Mary Jane Stout's life. This contradiction cast doubt on the integrity of Stumpf's conviction and sentencing. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in through the landmark case Bradshaw v. Stumpf, where it ruled that Stumpf's due process rights may have been violated. The court did not overturn the conviction, but did remand the case for further review. Ohio courts ultimately reaffirmed Stumpf's death sentence, determining that he was sufficiently culpable even if he hadn't fired the fatal shots. Despite the inconsistencies, his appeals have failed to overturn his sentence. As of today, John D. Stumpf remains on Ohio's death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. His execution, originally scheduled for earlier dates, has been postponed multiple times. His latest execution date is set for August 18, 2027, but given Ohio's moratorium in drug procurement issues, further delays are likely. Lawrence A. Landrum, Correctional Facility, Chillicothe, age at crime, 28. Lawrence Alfred Landrum was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1985 murder of 84-year-old Harold White in Chillicothe, Ohio. The crime occurred on September 19, 1985, when Landrum and his 14-year-old accomplice, Grant Swackhammer, broke into White's apartment intending to commit burglary. Upon returning home, White confronted the intruders. Swackhammer struck White multiple times on the head with a railroad bolt, causing him to fall. Landrum then sat on top of White, searched his pockets, and instructed Swackhammer to retrieve a knife from the kitchen. Landrum used the knife to fatally cut White's throat, resulting in his death due to massive blood loss. Following the murder, Landrum and Swackhammer stole approximately $80 and some medication from White's apartment. Landrum later boasted about the killing to several individuals and threatened them to keep silent. He was arrested on September 21, 1985, and evidence, including blood-stained clothing and the murder weapon, was recovered. In February 1986, a Ross County jury convicted Landrum of aggravated murder and aggravated burglary. The court found two death penalty specifications: that the murder was committed to escape detection for the burglary, and that Landrum was the principal offender in the murder while committing the burglary. He was sentenced to death shortly thereafter. Landrum's execution has been rescheduled multiple times due to ongoing appeals and issues related to Ohio's execution protocols. Currently, his execution is scheduled for October 13, 2027. Sean Carter, Correctional Facility, Chillicothe, age at crime 18. In the early hours of September 13, 1997, 18-year-old Sean D. Carter brutally assaulted and murdered his adoptive grandmother, Veter Prince, in her Farmington Township home in Trumbull County, Ohio. According to court records and police reports, Carter entered his grandmother's residence, where he committed a violent and fatal attack. The crime shocked the quiet rural community. Prince, a beloved matriarch in the family, had taken Carter in as her own. Yet in an unprovoked and horrifying act, he beat, stabbed, and assaulted her, causing severe trauma that ultimately led to her death. The investigation revealed that Carter had been struggling with emotional and behavioral issues prior to the incident. Evidence collected at the scene included blood-stained clothing and a knife matching the wounds found on the victim. Forensic analysis tied Carter directly to the scene of the crime. A neighbor's tip and Carter's own inconsistent statements also contributed to his arrest. Authorities described the crime scene as extremely violent, with indicators of a chaotic and frenzied attack. Following his arrest, Carter was indicted on multiple charges, including aggravated murder, assault, aggravated robbery, and aggravated burglary. During his trial in March 1998, prosecutors presented compelling forensic evidence and testimony from family members and investigators. Despite defense arguments centered on Carter's mental health history, the jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death later that same month. The Ohio Supreme Court, in its review, upheld the conviction and described the case as one of overwhelming evidence. In the years since, Carter has filed multiple appeals challenging the legality of his conviction and death sentence. His defense has argued that he suffers from schizophrenia and other mental illnesses, making him incompetent for execution. In August 2024, a Trumbull County judge ruled him mentally unfit for execution under current legal standards, pausing any further action until a 2-year reevaluation. The ruling came amid broader concerns about executing inmates with severe mental illness, a topic of growing scrutiny nationwide. Although Carter's execution was originally scheduled for January 22, 2025, Governor Mike DeWine granted a reprieve, pushing the date to November 17, 2027, citing Ohio's ongoing issues with sourcing lethal injection drugs and ethical concerns surrounding execution protocols. Carter currently remains housed at Chillicothe Correctional Institution on Ohio's death row, with his future pending further legal and medical evaluations. Warren K. Hennis, Correctional Facility, Ross. Age at crime, 30. Warren Keith Hennis was convicted and sentenced to death for the 1992 murder of Richard Myers, a 51-year-old laboratory technician and volunteer addiction counselor from Circleville, Ohio. On the morning of March 20, 1992, Myers informed his wife that he had an errand before his midnight shift at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. He never returned home or reported to work. Myers had been assisting Hennis with substance abuse issues, and on that day, he picked up Hennis from his Columbus residence. Later, Hennis was seen driving Myers' vehicle and in possession of his credit cards and checkbook. Hennis, along with his wife Tabitha and associate Roland Fair, used Myers' financial instruments to purchase drugs and merchandise. They forged checks and used credit cards, while claiming that Myers was incapacitated in a hotel room. However, he later confessed to killing Myers, alleging self-defense. Myers' body was discovered on March 25, 1992, in an abandoned water treatment plant. He had been gagged, bound, shot 5 times in the head, had his throat slashed, and his left ring finger severed post-mortem. In 1993, Hennis was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. His appeals have been denied, with the U.S. Supreme Court rejecting his final petition. Initially scheduled for execution on February 13, 2019, his date has been postponed multiple times due to concerns over Ohio's lethal injection protocol. Governor Mike DeWine has rescheduled his execution to December 15, 2027. Hennis maintains his innocence, asserting that he was wrongfully convicted based on unreliable testimony and insufficient evidence. Gregory Lott. Correctional Facility, Ross. Age at crime, 25. Gregory Lott was convicted for the brutal 1986 murder of 82-year-old John McGrath, a retired salesman in East Cleveland, Ohio. On the night of July 12, 1986, Lott broke into McGrath's home with the intent to commit burglary. During the invasion, he assaulted McGrath, tying him up, pouring a flammable substance on him, and setting him on fire. The victim was found alive by neighbors and rushed to the hospital with severe burns over most of his body. Despite initial survival, McGrath succumbed to his injuries 11 days later on July 23, 1986. According to medical testimony, he endured extreme pain during those final days. Authorities quickly identified Gregory Lott as a suspect due to his prior criminal history and proximity to the scene. Police found stolen items from McGrath's home in Lott's possession and traced footprints matching his shoes at the crime scene. Additionally, multiple eyewitnesses placed Lott near McGrath's house around the time of the break-in. Lott initially denied involvement, but later confessed during questioning, though he claimed he did not intend to kill McGrath. The sheer cruelty and prolonged suffering of the victim led prosecutors to seek the death penalty. Lott was convicted of aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and aggravated arson in Cuyahoga County. On August 24, 1987, the jury sentenced him to death, a verdict upheld through multiple levels of appeal. The Ohio Supreme Court described the crime as especially heinous and cruel. Despite numerous post-conviction motions, Lott has remained on death row for over 3 decades. In 2014, he was scheduled for execution, but Ohio Governor John Kasich granted a reprieve due to ongoing issues with lethal injection protocols in the state. Today, Lott remains on death row at the Ross Correctional Institution. Legal experts and advocacy groups have periodically highlighted his case in debates about the death penalty, particularly concerning the ethics of such a prolonged time between sentencing and execution. While appeals continue, there has been no ruling reversing his conviction. Lott's execution has been rescheduled to April 14, 2027. John Stoyetz, Correctional Facility, Chillicothe. Age at crime, 39. John Stoyetz is a death row inmate in Ohio, convicted for the 1996 murder of 17-year-old Damico Watkins at the Madison Correctional Institution. At the time, Stojec was serving a sentence and was identified as the leader of the Aryan Brotherhood within the prison. On April 25, 1996, he and 5 other adult inmates forcibly entered the juvenile unit of the facility, armed with improvised weapons known as shanks. They coerced a correctional officer into providing access to the cells, subsequently attacking Watkins, who was among the juvenile offenders housed there. The assault was fatal, and Stojec was later convicted of aggravated murder for his role in orchestrating and participating in the attack. Following his conviction, Stojec was sentenced to death and has been on Ohio's death row for over 2 decades. His execution was initially scheduled for March 14, 2024, but on October 15, 2023, Governor Mike DeWine issued a reprieve, rescheduling the execution to May 19, 2027. This delay aligns with broader concerns in Ohio regarding the state's lethal injection protocol, which has led to multiple execution postponements. Stojec is currently incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio. This facility houses many of the state's death row inmates and is equipped to manage high-security prisoners. Despite the rescheduling of his execution, Stojec remains on death row, with his case continuing to be a point of reference in discussions about prison gang violence and capital punishment in Ohio. Keith Lamar, Correctional Facility, Ohio State Penitentiary. Age at crime, 20. Keith Lamar, also known as Bomani Shakur, is a death row inmate in Ohio, convicted for his involvement in the 1993 Lucasville prison riot at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. During the riot, 5 inmates were killed, and Lamar was sentenced to death for the deaths of 4 of them: Albert Staiano, Bruce Vitale, William Svet, and Dennis Weaver. He maintains his innocence, asserting that he was not present in the area where the killings occurred and that the evidence against him was fabricated. Lamar has spent over 3 decades on death row, with his execution date having been rescheduled multiple times. His execution was initially set for November 16, 2023, but was postponed by the Ohio Supreme Court to January 13, 2027. This delay was granted after Lamar's legal team argued that the evidence used to convict him was unreliable and that he had been denied a fair trial. The rescheduling has drawn attention to concerns about the fairness of his conviction and the conditions of his confinement. Lamar has been held in solitary confinement for the majority of his time on death row, a condition he has described as mentally and emotionally taxing. Despite these challenges, he has become an advocate for prison reform, highlighting issues such as the use of solitary confinement and the treatment of inmates on death row. He has also engaged in artistic and intellectual pursuits, using his experiences to shed light on the injustices he perceives within the prison system. Each name on Ohio's death row carries a story, some of justice served, others clouded in doubt and delay. As executions remain on hold and appeals stack up, the fate of these inmates hangs in the balance. What lies ahead for them? Only time and the state of Ohio will decide. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter in America's most gripping criminal cases.